What's up, everybody? Joe Brown here. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and the inflation numbers are hot off the press. We haven't seen inflation this high this time since 1981. It's chugged higher yet again, up to 8.5%. On the backs of rising food costs, rising energy costs, rising rent costs, and all the usual suspects. So we're going to dive in to what that means for you and what we might expect going forward. Ready? Let's dive in. And now I'd like to take a quick moment to tell you about today's video sponsor, Vaulted. Vaulted is the secret to secure gold savings. They've developed a technology infrastructure designed to optimize gold investment strategies. They're reshaping the precious metals supply chain, and they've expanded access to allow you access to the world's most trusted universal currency. So what is Vaulted? Well, it is the best way for individuals and institutional investors to acquire physical gold. They've got the lowest cost structure in the industry. You get personal advising from their precious metals experts, and they have an extremely simple, easy to use, web-based user interface and app. It's so simple that it takes less than 1 minute to sign up for an account. And I know this is true because I use Vaulted myself, and it was absolutely so easy to set up an account. Now, the reason why I like to use a service like Vaulted is because number one, it gives you an extremely easy and automated way to build up your gold savings. On their website, they've got something called Vault Plan, which allows you to automatically invest in gold at the lowest cost available every single month or every other week. And then at any point that you desire, you can request physical delivery, and they will immediately start the process of shipping you physical gold wherever you want it shipped to. And if you've saved up enough to own an entire bar yourself, you are at that point assigned a serial number, and when you request delivery, you will get that exact serial numbered bar that you had allocated in your legal ownership and your possession. They have one-to-one allocation, no pooling, no leasing. Your gold is your gold. Turn gold into an easy-to-use savings account by signing up for Vaulted and start an automated Vaulted savings plan in order to start putting your money into gold. And whenever you want, whenever you get enough gold in there, you can request this gold to be physically delivered to your address on demand, and all the while you're getting it at the lowest cost in the industry. Sign up for Vaulted today with the link in the description below. All right, so yesterday the White House came out with a press release ahead of this inflation reading and said, hey, inflation is extraordinarily elevated. And it looks like they were doing a little bit of, hey, trying to prep you for something really bad, double digits, 10, 11%, so that when the new 8.5% number that is still much higher than it was last month and the month before and the month before, people would feel like, oh, it's not so bad. You said it was going to be very, very, very bad, and it's only 8.5%. But keep in mind, 8.5%, officially, it hasn't been this high since 1981, over 40 years now. The past inflation readings have been this high about 40 years ago. If we take a look at this chart, we can see, again, 1981 was the last time it was this high. Let's blow this up so you can see it a little bit better here. And the black line there is going to be the change in the core CPI, which excludes food and energy. And the red line is going to be the headline inflation number, which includes everything, including that food and energy there. And so you can see the black line is going to be obviously a little bit less volatile because food and energy prices are a little bit more volatile, but their demand is inelastic. And so if you're wondering, anything that is more closely approximating what the average person is going to experience in terms of price increases, you're not going to look at core inflation because you don't want to strip out the things that everybody has to buy regardless of what the prices are. And so you're going to look at that red number. And we can see here we're getting close to what it was back in the 70s. We're going straight up in that straight line. And interest rates, let me pull up the chart of interest rates here. So this is the federal funds rate. We can see here that interest rates during the 70s, the Federal Reserve was jacking up to deal with inflation. They triggered a recession in order to deal with the inflation there, had to combat inflation with some deflationary forces like raising rates here. And as you can see, that eventually did get a handle on the inflation. Let's see, 1981 back here, this was about where we were when inflation was as high as it is right now. And interest rates, the federal funds rate at that time was 15%. So obviously the Federal Reserve was trying to combat inflation this whole entire time before we got to that point. But the point is that the Federal Reserve had the capacity to raise interest rates. Now keep in mind at that time, federal debt to GDP was a lot lower. Federal debt to GDP during this time was about 30%. And so the federal government wasn't at risk of defaulting on its debt as it had to roll it over. Whereas right now we're sitting at about 123% debt to GDP. That means that the federal government is not making enough in taxes to cover what it owes when that debt matures, plus the higher interest rate it's going to have to pay on the new debt that it has to borrow in order to pay off that old debt. Back in the 70s, when interest rates were skyrocketing, they could afford it. It was still tough, but they could afford it. At this point, the only way they could afford it is if the Federal Reserve were to buy up 100% or close to it of the federal government's debt, so that all of that interest would be essentially swept back to the Treasury, essentially interest-free debt for the government. And right now, as far as right now is concerned, that has not yet happened. We haven't seen the rest of the world completely start to dump treasuries. If that does happen, then the Federal Reserve's balance sheet will explode by the amount that the rest of the world is dumping those treasuries, but interest rates would move a lot higher first. So last month, inflation was 7.9%. That was from February of 21 to February of 22. In March, it was 8.5%, so a big jump, 1.2% difference from February to March. A big driver of this was going to be gasoline. Food was also a major contributor this time. And here's what I want to focus on here. We're seeing a little bit of a muted number because of the large drop in used vehicle prices. So let's go over to used vehicle prices and see what they did. And you can see there's a big drop here. Whereas this whole entire time for, months and months and months, we've seen big spikes. But what I want you to take a look at there is the pattern. Obviously, we're not doing any charting or technical analysis on the prices of used cars here, but it does look like something that we've seen before. You see a big spike and then a short reprieve. As energy gathers up again, then you'll see a big spike and then a short reprieve. So could this be the top in used car prices? 100%. Absolutely, it could be the top. Is it possible that it's just another bull market correction in used car prices like we saw here, like we saw here, like we saw here? Absolutely, it could be. I think, in my opinion, it's far more likely that this is a short reprieve in the prices of used cars going up rather than a top of a bubble. Now, here's why. Here's the main reason why. If we look at what's driving the prices of used cars higher, basically cars are an asset. They're not an asset. Cars are something that go away. Right? You use them up. They're consumable goods. They're constantly getting in accidents. They're constantly getting destroyed. They're constantly breaking, and you have to fix them. And if you can't fix them, you have to get a new one. So absent any new cars coming into the market, the total number of cars in the market will decrease fairly quickly. There are a lot of car accidents. And if you can't fix them, then they're just totaled, right? They go to the junkyard. And so the total number of cars in the American fleet are going to be decreasing over time, absent any new cars coming in. Now, over the last 2 years, what have we seen happen to new cars? Major supply issues, from the normal supply chain issues, but also mainly from the chip shortage. The chip shortage has contributed to a major shortage in new cars coming into the market because every car these days has tons of computer chips in it, many times hundreds of computer chips in it, just in order to make it run. And if you're missing one of those, the entire thing doesn't work. So we've seen massive lots full of new cars that are each waiting on just one, maybe two computer chips before they can be sent out to dealerships and start to replace the aging vehicle fleet in America and replace the old cars that are breaking. And so because we've seen such a slowdown in new cars entering the market, the rest of the cars that are still there and still working have gone up in price, because absent new supply, maintaining constant demand with something that is decreasing in the existing supply, like cars, you're going to have, all else being equal, prices go up. Now, when Russia attacked Ukraine, this is a story that is pretty underreported actually, Ukraine had to halt output of neon. And if we scroll down here, this is actually a big deal. 45 to 54% of the world's semiconductor grade neon, which is critical for the lasers that are used to make computer chips, comes from 2 Ukrainian companies. So most people don't know this, but neon, you need neon in order to make the lasers that go in the machines that make computer chips. These are highly centralized industries where they're not widely distributed. And so that's why 45 to 54% of this neon that is necessary for the lasers that make chips, it comes from these 2 Ukrainian companies. So the fact that Ukraine is being invaded by Russia and that hasn't stopped yet, and they're the ones that are the biggest suppliers in the world of neon, they produce about half the world's neon. This is a massive deal. This means we're going to continue to have even if everything else is fixed, even if the inflation goes down, even if the monetary expansion goes down, even if the deficits, everything, let's say everything starts getting better, but this one thing continues where Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine and the output of neon continues as it currently is set. This is going to have major impacts for years on the number of chips that are being produced, because it's like gas for cars. If you can't put gas in your car, you can't drive anywhere. If you can't get neon for the lasers, you can't make the chips. And so this is going to have major issues on anything that needs computer chips, like cars. Cars obviously are one of the major things that have been impacted by the slowdown or by the supply chain interruptions for computer chips, and that has contributed to used car prices skyrocketing over the last couple of years. And so my expectation is that we continue to see a rise in used car prices, that this is not the top of the bubble. We're not going to see this come down significantly anytime soon. Now, the last thing that I want to focus on is the other reason for the rise in inflation, and that is housing prices. So let's take a look. Oh, before we get to housing prices, I just want to mention again, wages, real earnings, rose 5.6% from a year ago. So people who are making $100,000 in March of 2021 now are making $105,000 March of 2022. The problem with that is that prices went up 8.5%. So you got a 5% raise at the same time as you got an 8.5% pay cut. Is that a good deal? No. In real terms, when you adjust for purchasing power, you can't make ends meet the exact same as you could before. Your money doesn't go as far. It's the exact same thing as getting a pay cut. Your labor, your time, your capital, your savings are not worth as much as they were before. You can't get as much as you could last year. Despite the fact that the number of dollars increased in your bank account, the cost of food, the cost of energy, the cost of housing, the cost of living has gone up more than the number of dollars that entered your bank account. And so people, on average, in real terms, are getting pay cuts. And then finally, let's look here at owner's equivalent rent. Obviously, housing prices have continued to skyrocket, continue to go up here. And the housing portion of this is not accurately represented compared to reality. And the reason for this is something called owner's equivalent rent. I've talked about this before, but owner's equivalent rent is how they judge housing price increases in the CPI. This is highly deceptive because the way that owner's equivalent rent is measured is by basically asking property owners what they would have to pay in rent to be equivalent to their cost of ownership. Basically, they send out a survey and they ask homeowners, if someone were to rent your home today, how much do you think it would rent for monthly, unfurnished, and without utilities? Now, if you are someone who's owned one rental property, let alone many, you know with almost 100% certainty that anybody who has never owned a rental property, meaning most American homeowners, has absolutely zero idea whatsoever what their house would rent for if they were putting it up for rent. Very, very, very few people understand the difference between what they're paying for their mortgage, what they're paying for their utilities to live in their house, especially if they bought their house more than more than 6 months ago, right? Because their mortgage, if they bought their house 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, their mortgage is going to be a lot lower than what they're going to pay for rent if they, let's say, had to move out. A landlord bought their house and they were moving back in, and it was a landlord who had any experience whatsoever. So most homeowners have zero clue, zero idea what this number should be. And so it's a way to keep the inflation numbers muted because they know this. They know that the average homeowner has no idea what their house would rent for. So they're asking their homeowners, they're saying, hey, what would your house rent for if you were to put it up on the market? They're going to get a number back, and they're just going to plug that number into the inflation, into the total inflation basket, knowing full well that that's going to understate the reality of what people are paying for rent, what people are paying when they move, what people are paying for their housing costs. It's absolutely preposterous that that's the way that they come out with this number. In the end, we are seeing inflation continue to chug higher, and so keep saving in real wealth. Keep saving in things that will maintain your purchasing power. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, real assets like real estate, cash flowing property, farmland. Keep investing in things that will preserve your purchasing power and grow your purchasing power. Things like miners, commodities, the real things, the stuff that are more closely tied to basic human needs. Follow Maslow's hierarchy. As inflation goes up, as people become desperate, as people cannot afford the luxuries and the goods, what they end up doing is defaulting towards just the basic necessities. People are always going to need food, always going to need water, always going to need a place to live, always going to need clothes to put on their back. Those are the things that are going to really, unfortunately, benefit from the crisis, benefit from the catastrophe that we're seeing across the nation and across the world. And so investors who have positioned themselves to prepare for this are going to benefit by that. That's why you saw in the collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany, you see stories documented where farmers who had a cow, a goat, a couple chickens on a small piece of land, they were able to be the ones that could continue producing things that everybody had to buy, because all they had to do was rely on the land that they had. They were able to continue producing eggs. As they sold eggs, as they sold some milk, as they sold some cheese, the rest of their neighbors, their communities said, hey, you're getting rich. You're exploiting us. What are you doing with all of these riches and all this wealth that you're making by selling us eggs at these higher and higher prices as inflation keeps on going? And they said, we're paying off our mortgages. So these people had shorted their currency. The definition of a short is by borrowing something, and you're going to owe that back at some point, but you borrow something and then exchange it for something else. So they borrowed dollars, exchanged it for land. That's what a mortgage is. And then they use that to produce cash flow, have something that would be inflation resistant like food. And they shorted the currency and it had a cash flow producing asset, and they got very wealthy as a result. And finally, I'll be speaking at the Market Disruptors live event. It's in Dallas this year from May 6th to May 8th. I would love to see you there if you'd like to join me there, get some drinks with me, hang out. We're going to have a great time. It's going to be a fantastic conference. Tons of heavy hitters here this year, and I've got a link for you in the description below. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.